Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. And also thank you to our sponsors, which are on this slide right behind me. My name is Bana Katan, and I had the privilege of working on the exhibition Paul Pfeiffer, Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom. Thank you. I worked on this show with fellow curators Clara Kim, Paula Knoll, and Iris Colburn. And yes, let's clap for them too. For those of you who would like access to captioning for this talk, that is also on the slide behind me. Please scan the QR code now. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that there was meant to be a third panelist today, joining us today. But unfortunately, the panelist couldn't be here because of the difficulties of safe and free traveling for international visitors in the United States at the moment. And so with that, I'm extremely grateful for the panelists we do have. I am starting with Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa, who is a professor, is an artist and a writer. Iyko, who's a professor and also an author. And both of these are really long-time thought partners with the great artist Paul Pfeiffer. And Paul's show is on the 4th floor, so we welcome you after the talk to go up and peruse it, and then keep coming back until it closes on August 19th. The exhibition is a solo show that exhibits 25 years worth of Paul's career and work. With that, I will remind you to please silence your cell phones and enjoy the talk.
Hi, can people hear me okay? Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. It's nice to see you all. We wanted to start out just by asking a couple of questions to kind of gauge who all is in the room. So can I just ask by show of hands, how many of you have actually seen the show already? Oh, wow. Great. Hi. And then double hands. Yeah, okay. And then can I kind of secondly ask how many people in the room by show of hands have a kind of professional involvement with visual art? Okay, all right, thank you so much. That's the end of the hand-raising section of the talk. Yeah, I think we're all really thrilled to be here on the occasion of Paul's retrospective. I've been in conversation with Paul now for, I think, about 5 years, maybe even a bit longer. And Iyko and I met in a kind of context with Paul professionally, so it's nice to be reunited again. And I think we want to start by talking a bit about the name of the show and how that kind of activates the works within it. So obviously a bunch of you have actually seen it already, so we'll start with some sense of that kind of experience in mind.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Iyko, for being here with me. The title of the show is Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom. It's taken from a 2-channel video that I made in 2003, 22 years ago. And what I wanted to say for starters is that one kind of general idea that I have in my approach to image making has to do with this idea that somehow the material, more than the video image or one kind of a specific kind of hardware or any kind of physical material, that in some ways the real material of the work is memory itself, individual memory and collective memory. And in that sense, I think of each one of us as having a kind of already running system. And in a way, I'm thinking about images and situations that are stuck in my head and that I intuit might be stuck in other people's heads too. And I'm choosing what I think are the most potent of those images as a kind of entry point. Thinking of them as something, a way to access this kind of internal memory, both collective and individual, that we're each carrying around with us. So another thing is that I think of certain images as being like a kind of matrix, in the sense of, like, a matrix is a form that serves as a kind of like container for the creation of other forms, kind of like a mold or like a grid or a platform, an open platform. It's kind of the underlying structure that generates or engenders other forms. And so a matrix image, in its most potent case, would be the one that can engender as many different images or ideas as possible, in a way contains more than one meaning, more than one layer. This is the matrix image that ultimately I'm really searching for, because I think of it as the most potent and the one that can serve as the most open-ended entry point into the work. So one of those forms that I discovered a long time ago, in 2003, or that I became fixated on, was the Hollywood movie, The Ten Commandments. It was the most expensive film production of its era, and it was a biblical epic, basically telling the story of the Exodus. And what interested me about it is that, in a sense, you have like a 20th century retelling of one of the oldest surviving texts or like scripts that we have in the Abrahamic tradition specifically. So to me, what this 1956 film is a retelling of a retelling of a retelling of a retelling of a story that goes back centuries, in fact, millennia. And I'm kind of obsessed with this idea of the repetition of that, the reinterpretation of that in the present, and that it contains the DNA of the past. So in the movie The Ten Commandments, strangely, instead of opening up onto a kind of panoramic scene of something, the first image that you see is, in fact, a proscenium stage, kind of like the one we're standing on, which to me is already kind of strange, because like film replaces theater. So like, what is a film that opens with the image of a theater stage? And there's a big red curtain, and then you see a rustling of the curtain, and then out from the curtain comes Cecil B. DeMille, the director of the film. And there's a mic, and he steps up to the mic and says, "What you're about to see is the story of the birth of freedom." And so you'll see the piece upstairs. It appears about halfway through the show or so. And I've taken that image just about 1 second, just the moment when he's stepping out from behind the curtain, and I'm looping it, which in 2003, with the advent of digital media, to me it seemed like the most fundamental temporal structure of digital media. Like when you're working on with digital video, the first thing you do is scrub it, like play it back and forth. So that's what I was doing. And there's like, obviously then, a repetition that's happening, and it's happening in two ways. But in both cases in this piece, Cecil B. DeMille never makes it to the mic. You hear his footsteps coming from behind the curtain, and then see the rustling of the curtain, see him coming out, but he never quite makes it out. He's sort of stuck in a loop, eternally trying to come out from behind the curtain to give his prologue to the story of the birth of freedom. I just thought this was like a super suggestive image, and I had this idea that it wasn't just an image, but that what you're hearing are the sound of his footsteps eternally coming from behind the curtain. So yeah, this to me is an example of like a matrix image. And the story of Exodus itself, I think of as another kind of matrix narrative. I think of it as, in some sense, the very kind of like hardwired structure for thinking about change or revolution in the Abrahamic tradition. And whether we have any relationship with the Abrahamic tradition or not, it's, I believe, kind of one of those matrix structures which is a kind of like infrastructure below the surface of society, shaping notions of things like law and collective sociality, or like living as a community, and property rights, all kinds of things. So there's my rough breakdown of the title.
Well, part of what I find really engaging about the set of words in the title is that I think in many ways they frame some of the kind of consistent structural elements of your project over the last, more than 25 years now. And I spent a while thinking about prologue. I looked up the definition for the word, and I started thinking about the relationship between prologue and birth. And I started thinking about how, I think your work consistently engages, as you're sort of using the term matrix to suggest, these forms that have trans or intergenerational legibility, let's say. And it pivots around and reanimates iconic and iconographic dimensions of visual culture, which we inherit an orientation toward without willing it. There's a kind of history to the structure of feeling that we exist within in the kind of cultural moment we're born within, and your work picks these things up, but it never tells the story that is implied by the icon, right? There's a kind of consistency in the project of withholding, of deferring, of displacing the actual act of narration, which a prologue tells you is coming but doesn't itself actually engage in. Right, like a prologue is telling you something about the story that's to come that is by definition not the story. And in so many different parts of the work that you've made, we have this up on the screen, one of the most iconic images in the Four Horsemen series. As an example, the legibility of the iconography can give you the sense that a full story is unfolding, but what has been required to produce that feeling is the profound abstraction and removal of all of the material context that undergirds the iconography itself. And that labor has been invisibilized so that you can kind of fall into the illusory space of the icon itself. And then the work stages this iconography in such a way that it starts to deviate from its vernacular function, so that this image, for example, makes tremendous sense as a sort of visual evocation of Christ on the cross. But it's really difficult to know what the hell is happening in the sport that this picture has come out of, and how exactly it's happening, and what else is happening around it. The collectivity of meaning and of action that produces this choice and this physical response has been scrubbed from the scene. So for me, there's just this really rich and kind of continuous way in which the persuasive aesthetic force of the image in your work pulls me towards a story that it's going to refuse to me, and leaves me in a position where I need to start to think about the plurality of valences of the image that I'm drawn to and I'm captivated by. And this, of course, is a work from a series. So in isolation, it already works as a picture in a kind of classically autonomous sense, but it's actually part of a serial project called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And in that sense, it's evoking, again, a kind of broader and deeper set of histories. And it's using Black male athletic figures as the kind of protagonists in the conflation of those biblical symbolisms and histories together with the kind of iconographic exception that the image figures. So for me, I think you're in the prologue as an artist, gesturing constantly towards and eliciting us to kind of start to get engaged with the story that is yet to come. And the deferral of the desire for that story to be consummated, I think, is a really central and kind of foundational part of the practice that you've been engaged in. And it's that frustration of desire in relationship to the kind of falling into the visual space of representation that gives us work to do, but that also gives us this kind of pleasurable and immediate sensation of being immersed into and connected to these images that have passed themselves through these different generations. I find that to be really compelling, and I find it to be a kind of method of making that confers a lot of agency on the people that receive the image, but leaves space for it to operate, as you're saying, across a variety of different layers.
Wow, yeah.
It's hard. I hate following Stanley. I would also just want to pick up on the idea of the matrix and just the way in which we have these citational loops and how each iteration of a citation can kind of take us in different directions. So the title has a doubleness to it. There's a lot of double speak, I think, through the whole exhibition. So for me, I hear almost the prologue to the Birth of Freedom as almost like the birth of the nation, like W.D. Griffith. And I think about how this is kind of speaking about the prologue to the birth of capitalist modernity, underwritten by colonial genocide and enslavement, transatlantic slavery. Or I see it also as something more of like gesturing towards a post-apocalyptic freedom after the current period of what Dylan Rodriguez calls white reconstruction. And what white reconstruction is kind of maybe a way of describing our contemporary moment, which is kind of periodized as like the long post-civil rights era, where we have the rise of white nationalism, white nativism, Christian Zionism, all of the rest of it, which is a reinscription of kind of white being. And so are we going to be able to move past that? So that's one thing that your title signifies to me. And I think that maybe going back to the original, thinking about the prologue to the birth of like capitalist modernity and all of the violence that is necessary for that production, there's a way of going through the entire exhibition and seeing how sports, religion, propaganda, that they kind of coalesce and constitute kind of the sensorium of colonial racial capitalism as you go through. Yeah, so those are some of the thoughts about the title.
I mean, this is why I invited them. It's, I hope not too immediate of a deep dive. It kind of is, but like, I'm, absolutely invested in going deep. And one thing, there's just a couple of immediate thoughts I want to add to what both of you just said. One is that there's a visual dimension to what we're talking about. And so, I love, I'm thinking specifically of a reference to the writing of An Lin Cheng, who I know both of you are in dialogue with, and so am I, and so are a lot of us. And she makes this distinction between politics of visibility, which she associates with a kind of specific American mode of identity politics, the idea being that as one becomes visible in society, one finds a seat at the table, the table of liberal democracy, and therefore assumes their rightful place in society. And she proposes, as an alternative to this idea of a politics of visibility, a politics of visuality. And the way she describes the difference is that a politics of visibility is pretty straightforward. You become visible, you become a citizen, a participant, whatever. Politics of visuality is a bit more complex and includes a wider gamut of visual experience, including partial visibility or invisibility or mimicry, where one thing appears as one way, but is actually something else. Doubling, all kinds of like actually visible phenomenon associated with, say, surrealism or with the uncanny. That gets into like stranger territory, but actually describes, to me, more accurately, the real gamut of visual experience that we're talking about. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just to like unpack the Matrix narrative of Exodus. I have this idea that, you know, like especially when I'm teaching and I do studio visits with young artists who are finding their own language, I have this idea that I come back to often that in some ways the seeds of a completely new way of thinking or a new ontology, a new innovation in thinking would have to be somehow constructed through the language of the existing system. So there's this kind of like strange kind of seeming contradiction that the seeds of the revolution have to come somehow through a system that we're already speaking in. Like the new language has to come somehow. Yeah, and crowded out? Yeah. So in a sense, like, you know, I tell young artists, and maybe I tell myself, that in some ways, you know, the game is not just purely about invention, but like seeking a strategy, almost like a kind of poetry in which existing language can be almost like used against its tendency to replicate itself, to find some kind of internal glitch that can provide a pathway out of it, out of the loop.
Yeah, I think that ends up kind of pointing us back towards the intergenerational and transhistorical structure of the kinds of images that you're drawn towards in the context of a matrix, right? That part of what we're conventionally taught to do, say, for example, in the context of this category of picture we call the formal portrait, is to identify the subject, right? And that interpretive lens of looking for the subject, the honored figure of depiction, inevitably and kind of necessarily induces unconsciously a de-emphasis on everything that's structural to the kind of appearance of that figure as a figure as such, right? So that, for instance, you know, people in the room who are looking directly at us won't be thinking about the way that your eyes, in order to make us in focus, are unfocusing the people who are close to you, right? It's not a thought that we're taught to retain. But if you want the person one row in front of you to be in focus, you probably can't look at me at the same time. I'll be out of focus and they'll be in focus. So we're constantly making these choices about how to constitute the field of appearance, right? It's physiologically inescapable that we both produce the sense of the appearance of three figures on a stage as the subjects, and that we relegate everybody else who's actually right next to us in order to sustain the kind of interpretive coherence of us as three figures on a stage or three figures in a room. To kind of point towards another work that Paul's got in the show upstairs. And so, to me, one of the things that you do in your work is by pulling back, by paring back, you create a scenario in which it's possible to invest quite heavily in the ostensible coherence, individuality, and wholeness of that figure who, when you and I talk often, we end up calling the protagonist, in such a way that we phantomize the constitutive labor of appearance that enables the protagonist to be a protagonist at all. And that structure, which is both, I think, an affective thing and a physiological thing, is so profoundly useful to the perpetration and reiteration of forms of hierarchy, which want to relegate the constitutive labor of whatever to the margins in order to allow the figure, the kind of sanctified object, to have its preeminence. So that's baked into the physiological and symbolic structure of the image. And to me, that's baked into the way that so many of the works in your exhibition operate. And one of the ways I noticed that you do it, which I haven't sort of engaged with as much, I've written a long essay about Paul a while ago, which focused mainly on the long count, the Caryatid series, and the Four Horsemen. So I haven't really dealt with the installations much, but one of the ways I think you give this kind of spatial coherence is by splitting up the structure of the image and displacing its parts. So if those of us in the room who've seen the show think back to what happens when you get out on the fourth floor and you walk towards the entrance to the galleries, you'll see Paul's name on one side, the show's name on the other, and immediately to your left, there's a sort of odd wooden vitrine that has a white tent in the middle of a sort of diorama space. And that work is called Perspective Study, and it tells you that the work comprises two elements, but they're not spatially connected. And by the time that you've gone, say, left, past Empire, into the Saints, come back, you've moved through the Four Horsemen Gallery, you've seen Fragment of a Crucifixion, The Pure Products of the World Go Crazy, you move into the long count, you might have started to forget the tent, right? Like you might be looking at these other images in such a way that you forget that you've seen half of an object. By the time you then get into the back half of the show, or the back axis of the show, you'll then suddenly see a very, very large wall scale projection, which is the other element of perspective study, which has been structurally and spatially displaced. To me, there's this kind of constant recurrence in your work, materially as well as symbolically, of a disarticulation of the elements that are necessary to produce the visible scene. And we're given this opportunity as viewers to sort of fall into the trap of thinking that appearance is a thing that just happens, and in that sense of forgetting the kind of constitutive labor that is necessary to it being possible. So works like Three Figures in a Room, for example, or The Saints, or Perspective Study give spatial dimension to this kind of habit that we have. And I think if part of what you're suggesting is that, you know, in the kind of germinal seeds of Exodus and of the prologue to the story of the birth of freedom, there's both this kind of narrative of what revolution might look like, and also a description of a kind of form of storytelling which perhaps which keeps us stuck in the same kind of a loop. What I like about the way that the practice is structured is that we always have the possibility, the scope, the kind of spatial opportunity to think, seeing, as well as to feel it in your work. Like there's space to consider the way that you have felt or the way that you have looked. And to me, that might be the place in which one can begin to imagine a way to unwind our kind of deep, mechanical, reflexive attachment to this particular politics of visibility, which thinks only in the language of protagonism, right? Which can't retain a connection to the kind of ecology that enables a thing to be a thing, right? That I think is part of what, again, is materially and kind of symbolically baked into the operation of your work.
Yeah, I wanted just to pick up on 2 points around the question or the intersection of race and visuality and visibility, as well as to kind of think about and pick up the idea of how we might think about post-colonial mimicry. So how repetition can get us out into a different dimension, a new consciousness, right? That will crowd out, that will emerge out of the raw material of the horrors and take us somewhere else. But back to the question about race and visuality and race and visibility and connecting to Anne Chang, I think that there's like a dominant perception that representation is always a good thing, that being visible, and speaking as a person who studies Asian American visual culture, that having more Asian Americans in Hollywood films, for example, means that we've somehow achieved some level of recognition or political recognition of some kind. And however, people like Anne Chang and others, Vivian Huang in particular, have really shown that for the most part, by and large, Asian American women in particular, they appear in film only to be killed or to be suicided off. So they kind of appear for the function of disappearing. And so if that is their function, what is the point of that kind of form of visibility? So there's a kind of a cautionary tale, I think, in that kind of, that particular politics of race and visibility. And then going, so the second, shifting to the point about post-colonial mimicry, I see like across a lot of the works, this relation of the global South kind of enabling kind of the life of the spectacle and entertainment that we enjoy in the global North. And so a lot of the works in the show feature workers in a speech choir from the Philippines. We have there's also laborers that are part of the stadium that's not actually in the show, and then also the folio workers from Thailand. Right. So thinking about that kind of thinking about what's happening in the way that they are actually featured I'm thinking in particular of the Live from Neverland featuring Michael Jackson. So you have Michael Jackson's his televisual. It's not a confession, but it's like he's giving a speech about how he's innocent, et cetera. But you have a choir of a youth speech choir who's actually reciting his speech, and it's they're staged in the room together. And to me, this is really interesting when we think about the history of the Philippines and how part of the kind of prominent colonial discourse about Filipinos was that they have a penchant for mimicry, right? And so it's interesting to see it kind of restaged here. Also, that Filipinx are, they're constructed in a colonial imaginary as primitive, as childlike, as machinic, as being without content, really. So both highly assimilatable, but also unassimilable. And so what happens when we have these children who are reciting Michael Jackson's his speech? You kind of have what I think Jose Munoz would call disidentification, right? Where, they are kind of miming and rendering hyperbolic kind of the terms of his words. And at the same time, because they're kind of exposing the fact that they are the most unlikely people to be actually featured in this way. But to think about actually the idea of child abuse actually becomes really transformed when we think about the colonial construction of Filipinx as kind of forever childlike. Speaking back and kind of really scrambling our understanding of the kind of the global dimensions of this particular of what he's saying in his confessions. Or I feel like I'm rambling, but yeah, those are some of the ideas in terms of thinking about how these works disidentify with the particular discourse of celebrity or what have you.
Yeah, I really love the term protagonist or protagonism, and in some ways there's the protagonist, and then there's this almost like anti-protagonist, which is like the mimicking subject, the subject with no interiority. To be a mimic would be almost like to be like a parrot, to be somebody who just simply or like a monkey who simply sees behavior and repeats it without knowing what it is or without having kind of originality or actual subjectivity. So in a way, it's like two different figures, which in my opinion appear like two sides of the same coin. Like, in order for there to be a protagonist, the protagonist would have to distinguish themselves as almost like genius-like, self-creating against the backdrop of another kind of figure, which is not that. And in a sense, the not that part of it is shoved in the background and in a way repressed. But what I hear you saying both is that it's fundamentally necessary for the protagonist to even appear. Like the protagonist is nothing if not standing against a background of its opposite. I mean, in a sense, this like describes the situation as a system, the system always is constructed from multiple elements which mutually constitute each other. And in some ways, I feel like in all of the early videos in which elements are erased, I am looking at the image which has a protagonist in it, but through the lens of an editor looking at the picture as a whole as a kind of system. Like in the picture as a system, there's an element that's meant to be the focus of attention, and that's the foreground element, and that's the protagonist. And then there's a lot of other stuff that's going on that's meant to be almost like a foil for the foreground element and constitutes the background. And I've over the years said this many times that what looks like an erasure in these early videos is actually an act of camouflage, another form of visuality that's like mimicry. It's like camouflage in the sense that in camouflage you have, like, let's say, an insect behavior. The insect will change its coloration to match the background in order to get lost in the background, supposedly to protect themselves against, a predator.
But often also just because they like to do it.
Well, that's, one of the brilliant arguments of a kind of Lacanian psychoanalytic inflected analysis of this visual phenomenon. And in a sense, what I love about both of your writing and work and mindset, what's attracted to me to you guys is that I feel like you have a mind to somehow focus on this strange aspect of, in some ways, like I would sum it up in the word desire. Desire is kind of like where I'm projecting a kind of an attraction towards my opposite or towards my other, like the not me. I'm desirous of this thing that is not me, and yet I move towards it and I'm attracted towards it. And in some ways, like this describes this entangled relationship between subjectivity and its seeming opposite, which in visual terms, again, comes back to figure background. Like if I'm editing a video attempting to erase two boxers in the ring, what I'm actually doing is going frame by frame, analyzing where I can pull pieces of the background and cover over the foreground images, figures, with pieces of the background. So it's literally camouflaging the two figures with bits of the background. It's not erasing at all. It's reordering the foreground-background assumed relationship to create a kind of optical illusion that, when played in real time, presents a visual contradiction, much like an insect that is camouflaging themselves, and in my opinion, like, creates an uncanny feeling. Things are out of place, and it's moving too fast at real-time speed. I'm working on it frame by frame and could like lavish several hours over one frame. So I'm not working on this image in real time. I can totally pick it apart and spend my time just like intricately reordering everything. But then when I put it back into real time, it's too fast for you to like really absorb what you're seeing. You just feel it. Things are out of their normal places. But it does, in a sense, prove that to produce that feeling proves that the background and the foreground elements are equally valuable. They're mutually constituting the kind of the intuitive perception of a seemingly simple image. Even though all you usually see is like the figure in the foreground, the entire system of the image is actually equally valuable and necessary from an editor's perspective for the figure to appear.
Yeah, and that to me, that strikes me as a kind of politics of visuality, to come back to Anne Cheng, who you were referencing before. I think a lot about when I'm looking at your work and in the show upstairs, the differential valence of illumination as such, like to be illuminated, to be venerated by the presence, the activity of light, to be singled out, to be put in focus. If at this point in the day, for example, it's not so easy from the outside of the museum to see it, but up on the fourth floor, in transparencies that have been cut to fit the interior of the windows of the museum facing out, I guess, away from the lake, which would be west. This figure, this exact picture has been cropped. And it's been cropped in such a way that the hands, as they're stretched out at right and at left, fill the entire lateral width of the windows of the face of the museum. And given the quadrilateral structure of the windows on that facade, there's a blank space right down the spine of the figure, which means the head doesn't appear, right? And so when you're standing in the fourth floor before you turn left to go into either the left side or the right side of the exhibition, if you're just standing in the middle of the hallway, you're standing inside this figure's head. And it's scaled in such a way that your whole body actually can fit symbolically into the pictorial space of this figure's head. And this figure is a declamatory figure facing towards the city of Chicago, who I happen to know is also a New York Knick, which I find very funny. But this figure is engaged, I would argue, in a kind of gesture of declamation that is thoroughly and impossibly inseparable from its precise opposite, which is to be pinned by the police, which is to be subjected to the action of kind of mechanical, industrial, organized light. And the figure has been decapitated both within the space of the image by light. Like, light is what overwrites that figure's legibility as an individual. And then in the case of the structure of the facade of the building, the figure has been decapitated by the building itself, but scaled to the proportions of the building as though they were that giant. So there's an ascension into a position of preeminence. There's an ascension into the role of a protagonist, scaled to the kind of the heft of this building. And simultaneous with that ascension, there's an eradication of the individual identity and thus the kind of historical formation of the person we're looking at, whose name I won't reveal, not because it's especially sensitive, but just because that's part of the structure of the work as I understand it. And it calls to mind for me in a way that I find really compelling another work in the exhibition upstairs, which is Race Riot. And Race Riot, here I will actually sort of talk more about what's in the image, because I recall seeing that footage live, and this might sort of lead us into other parts of Paul's practice. So Race Riot is, I think I'm correct in saying, a 4-second video on a permanent loop in the kind of flip-out display of a digital video camera that's situated inside of a plexiglass enclosure underneath one of these massive sort of 15 feet high freestanding walls in the exhibition upstairs. You may or may not have spent a lot of time with it, but it has a specific and I think quite rich relationship to the city of Chicago, because it's a clip of the moment at which the Chicago Bulls won the first of their second three-peats of NBA championships. So Game 6, 1994, I think I'm right in saying, they beat the Seattle Supersonics here in Chicago. And at the moment of the victory of the championship, Michael Jordan wrests the ball away from whoever happened to have it and falls to the ground in floods of tears on what happens by coincidence to be Father's Day 1994. And it happens by coincidence to be a month shy of 3 years after his father was murdered in North Carolina by a Native American man and an African American man, in a moment in which people in this country were happy to speculate that Jordan himself might have been responsible or implicated in some capacity in his father's murder. So here you have one of the most sanctified and symbolic and iconic figures in the history of American sports and in the history of this city, who's collapsed to the ground. And in the 4-second clip that you've chosen, and I've seen a bunch of angles of the footage of this moment because I was a Chicago Bulls fan as a teenager, this was a moment that I was massively invested in. You've chosen an angle where another one of his teammates has come and kind of embraced and collapsed himself over that figure and hidden the figure within that embrace. And then other hands come reaching in. And what it looks like they're doing is caressing the player who is himself embracing Jordan, who's hidden right at the kind of root of the ensemble. And you've called that moment Race Riot. And one of the things that I think very often happens in kind of the vernacular dimension of Euro-American culture is that when we say race, people think non-white. So it's easy to think that a race riot is a thing that black or brown people do, but in this country, a race riot is a white thing. It's actually a thing done to people who carry racial difference as against the kind of norm of whiteness. And so for me, there's this occultation of that scene by this sort of mélange of bodies in kind of perfect, immaculate white. And at the root of all of it, there's a ball, right? And it's the same ball we see in John 3:16 as we walk into your exhibition. It's the same kind of circular orb that we're seeing in this image here. It's the same activity of directed illumination, except in this moment, he's been afforded privacy as maybe the most mediatized figure in the history of the sport. And he's been afforded it as a function of the thing that you've chosen, the moment that you've chosen, the way that you've rendered it, in what I would take to be one of the most complicated and multivalent moments in his experience of being an athlete, of being a human being, and certainly of being an icon. So for me, there's this thing in your work where the act of being imaged, of being revealed, to come back to this question of a contradistinction between visuality and visibility, is profoundly multivalent and ambivalent. You know, it's not inherently a veneration. It's not inherently, for all its material rewards, it may not add or confer more freedom, to come to another term in the title of your show. It may in fact confer the precise opposite of freedom, which is a thing that we learn from Jordan if you watch the documentary about the whole process of winning these two triple championships. And I think that that's part of the kind of machinery of thought that can connect differently with the structure of feeling, which gets us to want somehow to be one of these figures in these frames. And I think that part of what you end up doing, even like, for example, in this picture, in the instant that you choose the kind of the fraction of a section that you alight upon, is you find a way to sustain the contradictory valences of the kind of gift of appearing. And you connect it very, very materially to racialization itself within the space of performance. This is about as free and wealthy and visible as a black body can be in this country, right? But what does that freedom comprise? What is it undergirded by? What does it depend upon? These are questions I think that become possible to think as one approaches these scenes as a function of the way that you both use light to induce an instinctual affective response and then complicate the value of receiving its attentions, you know? I think there's for all the kind of legible imagery in your project, the occultations are just as much a kind of fundamental part of the engagement with appearance as anything else. The hiding of Jordan, the hiding of that figure's head and face that fronts the building, those are as important and structural to the project as the legibility of the arms, as the legibility of the figures. And that double-ended or sort of dialectical dynamic, I think, is itself a kind of ethic of dealing with the complexities of representation.
Yeah, that's...
Oh, I wanted to try to comment on a few things, but just I like the idea of camouflage. I guess the way that I always looked at the way that you subtract things or take things out, and is that you're kind of engaging in a sort of perceptual physics, and really what I call like using concealment to reveal. And because I see, when I see the things that you've removed or concealed or sort of changed our perspective on, it really exposes the kind of simmering violence of like capital's own obscuring perceptual physics. And so instead of seeing the boxer or the basketball player, we actually kind of see something else. We see a racialized laborer, or who is basically, or like a condemned gladiator, who is basically, his body is being exploited for violence, for entertainment, for profit. And back to that, particularly the Michael Jordan image, I mean, all of those images, to me, when you were talking, just reminded me of Saidiya Hartman's scenes of subjection. I mean, this is a scene of a black, all of those images of extreme black affect, either whether because when it's in a repetitious loop, it looks like exaltation that turns into kind of horror and trauma for the pleasure of the audience. And part of one of Saidiya Hartman's arguments is that it's not that there's a white enjoyment in that sort of scene of suffering, and that there isn't really an empathy really at all. And so again, coming back to the distinction between visibility and visuality, right? So that was, those are some of the thoughts.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I happened to see, like a couple of years ago, Triple Canopy, at their gala, just featured or gave a kind of honorific award to Andrea Fraser, and she gave a really amazing speech in acceptance, at the end of which she pied herself in the face. It's very bizarre, but one of the things that she said is coming to mind right now. She said, honor is always haunted by the ghost of dishonor. To me, to receive the award is to make the slam dunk, to become the most valuable player, to become the most wealthy athlete or whatever. And there's this, it's the essence of the protagonist. The protagonist is the honorific figure. It's the one figure that stands in for everyone in an aspirational way. And so a lot has to be pushed into the background, for that honorific to appear. And we all know, it takes a village, it takes, from a systems perspective, in a way, the central problematic of protagonism, the narrative system or the narrative tradition, that everything must hang on the central figure, the protagonist. The story must be driven by the will of an individual. From a systems perspective, the problem with protagonism is that it creates this kind of dependency on the notion of a kind of individual agency, even though we know that that's not how it works. We are all entangled in systems, and yet we're sort of fated to fool ourselves that that agency must happen through the independence of the individual character. And in some sense, to me, then a certain kind of poetic speech, what it can do is to give a kind of intimation or to just simply reveal the deeper truth of a seemingly contradictory entanglement, that we are always, that each of us is always, having to live with individual responsibility while at the same time being a kind of function or an effect of the system that we're in. We are both independent and we are completely an effect of the system. And we can't hold these two ideas simultaneously in a way on an intuitive level. We can't see the object and step back far enough to see that it's all an illusion and that there's a grid and a kind of internal structure that's determining things behind it. But in some sense, it would just be too much to be walking around in day-to-day reality thinking on this deeper level. In a way, the best you could do is to have moments in which a space of poetry can bring you into a remembrance that that's a deeper truth that exists. You kind of leave your normal realm of day-to-day experience once a week, go to church or read poetry or meditate, and just kind of for a second, like go into an elevated or a deeper plane of thinking in which the illusion of kind of like individual agency as a kind of fundamental reality, supposedly, you know, you allow yourself to kind of let go of it and feel, like vibe on this deeper truth, that there's other things going on, that it's too much to focus on a day-to-day level. And in some ways, I think of, you know, in its most progressive sense, like the story of the Exodus points towards this as like well, it's too much to go into, but you know, there's I think ways to go into it. But just to say, like, I'm very interested, you know, in this idea of the opposite of the protagonist. One way to think of it is the uncivilized person, the child, the kind of, yeah, just, you know, whatever the kind of functioning, heroic, you know, like honorific version of the citizen, of the individual as the apex of, you know, of achievement, of individual achievement in society. The thing that we're all kind of aiming for in our lives. The opposite is just simply that opposite state of not having achieved it, not having somehow, you know, come to this point of like of just, you know, internal integration into a kind of wholeness of like the like possibility of like, you know, human achievement. And so I just like this idea that somehow, well, you know, if there's this tradition of protagonism, and I think of it as being associated with, say, like the 19th century form of the novel, or of the portrait, you know, like in the novel, you are following a linear path through a story, and in a sense, your primary guide is the protagonist. And there's many exceptions and like interesting kind of, you know, more complex version of it, but essentially the narrative is driven by a protagonist. And you as a reader, first and foremost, on chapter 1, page 1, more or less establish a one-to-one connection with the protagonist, such that in a sense, you can project yourself into the position of the protagonist, and then you proceed through the story, like walking through the world from the protagonist's point of view. And then in modernism, other things happen in which the protagonist becomes fragmented and so forth. But essentially, there's an inherited structure that I associate with protagonism. And it occurs to me, and you know, just in gaming, there's this other kind of storytelling that goes on, which I'm, you know, like simplifying, but in a gaming environment, you're also going through a story, but it begins by being plopped into the center of a maze, and you're not given any instructions. In a sense, you're going to learn by doing. In like a first-person shooter game or whatever, you know, you're in the center of a maze. You learn the rules by getting killed, and then you think, I won't do that the next time. But you proceed through the story like more or less. It's very dreamlike. But you're not given the stable starting point of a protagonist per se. It's more like you woke up from a dream, or you suddenly find yourself in a dream, and you're trying to figure out what the rules of this space are, how to navigate it, and hopefully like how to get out of there or something. This to me like resonates strongly with like, you know, a sense of what the experience is like in the highly mediated environment that we're in now. There's like too many protagonists. The protagonists are like changing their identities constantly. You know, the head of the nation is a trickster, and it's like constantly morphing. So like the sense of like a kind of stable protagonist that's leading collective society has completely broken down. And what we're dealing with now is something more like a dream in which you're trying to understand like the space you're navigating in, what the rules are so you can survive. I just want to jump to like this idea that I have that in some sense, like to be a protagonist, to be human is not something we're born with. Like from a Buddhist perspective, like being born is like gaming. Like you didn't have a choice. You don't even like remember how you got there. You just suddenly got there in a pretty violent way. You exit with a lot of blood and like pain from another body, and now you've arrived. And what happens from there, in a sense, you arrive in trauma. And then what happens from like day one till whatever, when you turn 18, is a process of like learning and discipline in order to acquire the mantle of humanness. And in a sense, there's like a lot of violence in education to bring you from the raw state of trauma in which you're born into and the state of supposed wholeness or citizenship that you receive when you're 18 years old. In a sense, like part of that process, it's necessary to become a protagonist. You got to repress or otherwise invisibilize everything that you actually did experience from day one. And yet, that does not go away. That just goes underground. That becomes a part of your unconscious. So in a sense, I just like this idea that like the functions of a certain kind of matrix image is to reveal back to you something that you forgot because you purposefully repressed it or erased it in order to become a human that you weren't actually born as a human.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about camouflage as you were talking there, because it strikes me that part of what your acts of camouflage in the space of appearance tend to do is to turn the activity that's unfolding, especially in the video work, into a kind of rehearsal, which is to take it out of live action and to bring it into a space of abstraction. So, if people remember walking down the long hallway of the Saints towards the tiny console at the end and seeing that little monitor and the black and white image there of the player on the field, you may or may not know intuitively what kind of a sport you're looking at, what moment. You may have read the wall label, you may not have read the wall label, but I suspect that anybody who sees that moving image will quickly figure out that something is very wrong with the sort of visible field in which it's unfolding, because this person is making a bunch of choices and decisions that appear to be wholly disconnected from any kind of consequence that would involve anyone other than themselves. And that in and of itself is a kind of productive contradiction. And then the way that Paul edits the piece, I think, adds a productive layer to that contradiction, which is that as the different clips are fused together to produce the illusion of continuity, the cut is made always in such a way that the figure stays in the same place in the composition. So what changes is the ground, but what stays stable is the figure, right? The figure has a kind of trans-historical continuity within the unfolding of the video, and the ground keeps suddenly and catalytically and disconnectically just changing. And all of that is as a function of having looked for the integrity of the figure first and foremost, because if you were making the cuts differently, the figure would dance all over the frame if you were looking for a different kind of continuity. So I think it creates a scenario in which the image becomes a space to kind of rehearse and to consider one's own intuitive assumptions about what makes sense, about what is logical, about what forms of choice and behavior conform to an intelligible type of being. When I was watching the caryatid pieces, and it was especially potent under the lockdown, I spent a good chunk of the summer of 2020 watching your work online, and Sable Elise Smith produced this web intervention called FTP, which is an acronym for Fuck the Police. And she reproduced, she showed in that installation a bunch of the caryatid works. And I always find the caryatid pieces of the boxers extraordinarily difficult to watch. I've never been able to get interested in watching boxing or any kind of pugilistic sport, and I'm a huge lover of Three Figures in the Room, so there's an absolute contradiction in that statement, but it's just true. And in my early experience of the caryatid works, I thought so much about the visible figure. I sort of overemphasized in my kind of attention to the figure whose name is in parenthesis in the title of the work. So upstairs we have both Mayweather and we have Pacquiao. It took me a long time to start to think about the invisible figure who's also in the ring with them, which is to say to think about all of the constitutive background that's been replaced in the front of the picture, and to start to think about whether learning how to understand in the round, which is a term I kind of want to hang over a bunch of your work actually, learning how to understand the constitutive kind of ecosystem of appearance in the round and knowing how to fit into that in such a way that you can reproduce all of its elements is a certain kind of an ethic. If we know how to do every function that involves the reproduction of this museum, we're quite useful to the community of people that depend upon it. If we only know one, we're less useful, right? So the invisible figure in the caryatids for me is it can be understood to be doing a certain kind of work that requires a much broader contextual awareness of the circumstance in which they are not appearing. And simultaneous to that, the capacity to know how to do that so that you yourself are veiled from appearance creates a kind of intermediary space within the visual field. So the figure's not ever legible as a figure, but they're there the whole time, and you know they're there. And when I wrote about the caryatid works in my essay, I ended up thinking about whether instead of construing the invisible figure who's raining blows on the visible figure as an antagonism, whether that isn't or can't be thought about as an attempt to overwrite the legibility of the opponent, to bring them both back into a state of absolute invisibility, such as you have in the Longcamp pieces, which is to say that maybe a kind of intermediary step out of the kind of trap you're describing in the kind of structure of Euro-American subjectivity, which so zealously identifies and over-identifies with the individual, is to try to learn how to camouflage ourselves out, which is to say to learn what context do we exist in, what are all the forces and histories and forms of violence that have constructed this arrangement, and how can I, instead of seeking to step forth within this particular morass, figure out how to recede, figure out how to cease to demand that kind of individuated attention. That's a possible reading of the way that that work works that doesn't unfold if your first and sort of primary identification is with the individual. But if you can start to look askew, if you can start to look askance, I think the work discloses other ways in which an image can be a space for a certain kind of rehearsal of affective relationship to appearance as such, which in the political context of a moment that's for so long now been ordered by images might be the beginning of a certain kind of anti-normative hope, let's say. But I'm conscious that we're sort of roughly an hour in, and people who haven't had a chance to speak to you might want a chance to ask you a question or two. So I just want to invite people, if you have a question for Paul, there are people on either side of the aisles here who've got microphones. If you just put up a hand, someone will come towards you and pass one down the line. If you'd like to ask Paul a question, then we have some time now for you to be in dialogue. I can see there's a hand down here. Maybe there was one up there.
Hello, thank you. My name's Cameron. You're using like these computational metaphors like hardware, matrix, and then you're also like opening up possibilities around disrupting like mechanical ways of being maybe. I'm wondering if there are like moments in history or times and places where you see this occurring, like sites where this is like particularly salient.
Yeah, there's, this is now speculative. I had the opportunity to develop a kind of presentation about the work of Bruce Nauman for DIA a few months ago. And it's still a work in progress, actually. I kind of just presented what I had at that moment. But it occurred to me that there's this kind of like strange contradiction represented by Naumann, who I think of in some sense as like the ultimate American, specifically contemporary art protagonist. You know, one of the most iconic artists of contemporary and conceptual art. There's something like specifically American about him. You know, he created a lot of his videos and self-portraits when he was like in his 20s and 30s. So he's sort of like forever captured as this young, kind of, you know, handsome, lithe figure who wears t-shirts and jeans and like is, you know, fabulously like informal, but like completely charismatic, and so he really captures something that is like, for example, Ralph Lemon refers to like his like annoying Americanness of self-presentation, and at the same time, there's something like very odd about him because in fact what he does throughout his entire oeuvre is various variations of self-evacuation. Like, you know, he is building up his self-image as this like ultimate protagonist, and yet what he performs over and over is to somehow like disappear or render himself absent or render himself abstract, and you know, does similar things with language itself, like takes all the vernaculars of everyday American speech, common phrases, and then just endlessly repeats them until they become like these weird, meaningless abstractions that are like matrices that just contain all possible readings, because it's just like language that's rendered into an abstraction. So, periodizing him to the 1960s and associating him with the generation of the original minimalists, which is simultaneously, in some ways to me, well, one of the things that I discovered when I was researching him is that one of the books that was being read by all the minimalists in New York at the same time was one of the like books that are considered central references of cybernetics. And so there's this idea that I have to like really prove with further research, that, I mean, if you think of the minimalist object that's being invented in the 60s, and the fact that what they were reading were books on cybernetics theory or like systems theory that were written in the 30s, that they're then creating these objects that are reduced and reduced and reduced to their most abstract fundamental forms, such that they both appear as objects, but seem to like disappear into the architecture. It's a kind of object that, in a way, really like situates itself precisely in this kind of gray zone between foreground and background. An object that is monumental, and yet I see Anthony Elves going, no. I want to, yeah, this is a different conversation that I hopefully maybe later on in the show can like get into it at another public talk, but yeah, just, you know, this is how I parse it. What's happening at that moment is in some ways like, you know, a generational emergence onto notions of systems theory. And the way it looks, though, is the production of a new kind of object. And in fact, you know, generationally, there was a lot of stuff happening. There was like really like performances that looked like made out of rubbish. Like, you know, there was wild experimentation going on at that time, but what seemed to like really stick was the minimal object, and becomes from that point forward almost like a universal language of contemporary art, a language of abstraction, and a language in which the object like seems to like precisely situate itself between objecthood and non-objecthood. And so, more or less, I guess what I'm trying to like point to is that, in some sense, like I actually think that what they're doing is a play on the object as a decoy. I mean, in a sense, if you start to think in terms of systems theory, then you know that what you're doing as an artist is actually arranging space and time within the exhibition space. You're choreographing the movement of the viewer through space. And it could be like a really interesting decoy to put a seemingly simple object into that space. Because from a systems perspective, you would know that the bias would be that the viewer would fixate on the object and move towards it, when in actuality what you're doing is choreographing everything, including the space around the object, and the object is just like one part of the game you're playing. So in some ways I feel like, you know, it's interesting to me that in some ways like the minimalists either themselves or other people project that they've invented a new kind of object, when in actually what they're doing is they're moving into like the realm of thinking in terms of like the creation of systems or environments, and the control of movement through the environment, but very like cannily or smartly using decoys to call your attention away from the bigger game that's being played. And in a sense, like to me, you know, what's like at stake is that what we're talking about is a game that is not just to do with objects and kind of aesthetic production, but it implies a similar, like wider revolution in subjectivity. You know, the object is like the individual. And in a sense, you know, even though we like don't think of it as such, I mean, with social media, with everything, like we're swimming fluidly through, you know, a completely fragmented environment, presenting ourselves as individuals, while at the same time, I mean, in a sense, we're all witches now. Like at least half of our agency has to do with the invisible shit that we do.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to also, thinking about just the digital and technological dimensions, like what kind of underwrites that, the development of those technologies, is also something that's kind of featured in the show with the perspective study, which is a diorama of a jungle with a tent in it. And so so I think that what's happening, especially relating to the idea of being a subject, you know, you are looking into the diorama, seeing maybe a colonial scene with a tent in it, but there's a hidden camera there. So when you get through to another part of the exhibition space, you actually become the surveilled, or close to the surveilled, because there's a tent that's projected onto the wall. And so there is this kind of, you think that you have the God's view, you are the protagonist, right? And so these are all about, you know, this is about colonial surveillance and how that technology has literally boomeranged and is now what is on our phones, what is now making my life terrible as an academic, in terms of like, what do I have on my social media, you know, which is now subject to inspection when I'm at a border. So all of those things are kind of, you know, the infrastructure of all of that I just wanted to, you know, call attention to the colonial infrastructure of that technological development. The other thing too, just talking about protagonists as well. I mean, you mentioned the novel. I mean, the novel is also periodized with the rise of capitalism as well. So when you think about like the arc of the protagonist, realizing, overcoming some sort of adversity and resolution, maybe actually what I see in the show is actually a thwarting of the protagonist. Going back to the Live from Neverland, really, which is what Bana revealed to me, is that actually what's happening in that is the speech choir, Michael Jackson is actually attuned to their tempo. So in fact, he is not the protagonist. So what they have done is they've wrested his status as the protagonist away from him. I don't know if that means that they're the protagonist, but maybe there's something else, right? They're at least canceling out his protagonism. And then, I mean, similarly with the perspective study, you think you're the protagonist, but actually you're the object. And so I feel like there's this constant perspectival shift of who we are. And I think that, yeah, like we need to get rid of individualism. I mean, that literally is the central trope of capitalism, right? And so maybe, I don't know, maybe the post-apocalyptic futurity is actually in the hive, which is in the show as well, where we see a different kind of form of sociality taking place where, you have a collective construction of something that doesn't get any recognition. All the bees die when the hive is complete, and it's just there for the future, right? So I don't know. So just thinking about how does this show also like really maybe complicate or challenge that idea of that protagonism as well?
Yeah, and just to say really quickly that, to me, what you just said relates to what you brought up at the beginning, and maybe don't have time for it, just some notion of like a post-colonial mimicry or camp, like a play on language where you're just, constantly, in a way, like reappropriating and reinventing inherited language that might otherwise be used to pin you down, and really having fun with it. I just think of like gay speak.
Hi, this question is for Paul. My name is Esperanza. So hearing you speak, you mentioned spirituality and specifically the seventh day of church and meditation in Buddhism. My question is, did the system of beliefs and spirituality come before the work or as a result of its creation, or was there any change along the way?
Well, in a way, it came before. Thank you for that question. But only because, both of my parents were church musicians in a Protestant church in the Philippines, a Protestant American church in the Philippines. So in some ways, it's definitely consequential for me. And then I feel like I've been very intentional for the past 25 years in my work too. In a way, just to unpack that kind of personal inheritance, which is both arbitrary and meaningful to me. To grow up kind of from that perspective of like church musicians, in a way it's like more culturally Christian than theologically Christian, and in the sense that like, I literally grew up kind of with my parents daily and weekly preparing the music for the Sunday service. So in a sense, like I was kind of backstage watching the preparation and performance of the collective ritual with all of its mechanics and rehearsals and choirs and practicing organ and so forth. So in a sense, that is kind of like an orientation that is built into my particular experience. But then I'll just say that, in some ways I'm just, I'm interested in spiritual learning and of all traditions, and in a sense, like there was a period in the 90s when I just became curious about like classical architecture and really started delving into it. And a lot of my titles come from a kind of study of classical architecture, but the most compelling thing about it is just simply this idea that in, say, like classical forms, like in forms from antiquity, are patterns like sets of relationships, ratios, proportions, mathematical formulas that serve as a kind of like baseline operating system that is being constantly updated, but in a sense never changes on like the most basic level. And so to me, the study of kind of spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhism or like Torah study or biblical study, titles like John 3:16 have to do with this idea of an inheritance that's running deep down below the surface, constantly being updated and repeated generation by generation, inflecting everything that we think of as not just spiritual, but what do you call that? Like not religious, or just secular society, law, like language, just basic ideas of like how we live together. Everything is somehow inflected by these repeating patterns underneath. And what I want to say about like the story of Exodus is that there's a specific moment, like Moses is this kind of like bastard son who has a double identity, and he's growing up as the son of Pharaoh, but he's actually coming from like a slave family background, and it's just kind of a fluke that he ends up occupying this like unique position of being almost like the bridge between opposite ends of a labor system, a production system of that generation. And it's so funny to me that he becomes uniquely the carrier of the story. But what actually happens, not to get too deep into it, but he runs into problems and is excommunicated or self-excommunicated, and goes out into the wilderness, ends up studying with like Bedouin or like an indigenous family in the wilderness, and then for years, and then at some point has this revelation from like a cosmic, godly voice telling him that he is the chosen one who's going to like take the slaves out and become the leader of the revolution. It sounds like a lot of Hollywood movies. But the hybrid nature and the kind of like, scrambling of authentic biological codes, and how that coincides with him being the chosen is super interesting to me. He is almost like the code switcher. And the other thing is that like, when God tells him he's got to do this, his immediate reaction is like, no fucking way. Like, not me, I don't want to do this. And in this, like, this is an interpretation now. I think what he actually says to God is like, I don't want to do this because I know already what's going to happen. Like, I'm going to lead these people out of their condition of slavery, and they're going to end up creating a new hierarchy that repeats exactly the same pattern. So, screw this. I don't want to do this because it's going to be like totally pointless. We're going to end up looping back into the same place, just in a different iteration. So, yeah, like that is the problem. Like, how do we exit?
Probably time for one more.
Thank you. It was really brilliant and kind of, mind-blowing conversation. I was thinking about what you were saying, Paul, about the protagonists and that idea of camouflage or concealment. And I mean, something maybe obvious came to mind, which is Edouard Glissant's idea of opacity, or Fred Moten's ideas around fugitivity. And I'm wondering if the protagonists in your work are some kind of, I don't want to say metaphor, but maybe stand in for your practice in a wider sense, where I feel like, in a moment of very, let's say, market-driven moment of identity politics, there seems to be a kind of, not concealing, but let's say that when one looks at your work, it's hard to have any biographical element appear or transpire, maybe except for the fact that you grew up Christian, which appears here and there. So yeah, I'm wondering if there is this kind of parallel between what happens in the work and what happens with your practice in a more meta sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really love the idea of a kind of post-colonial mimicry as a mode, and like more and more, I think that there are aspects of the, like growing conversation around what you're pointing to in Glissant and the idea of opacity as a kind of like thing to, as an almost like an essential part of a kind of aesthetics of the Caribbean tradition, which would account for all of the violence that one inherits. To counter the kind of fundamental state of a surveillance capitalism that you're born into, you have to, as an aesthetic practice, develop ways to become invisible or opaque, or to avoid the dangers of visibility. And so I think that there's a similar kind of like aesthetic tradition in Southeast Asia. And so I'm really into this idea that, there's a global South, maybe, aesthetic discourse that's emerging that we didn't have even a couple of decades ago, and is becoming more and more of a crowd, which is super cool. And that we can really entertain these ideas of a kind of a new aesthetics that does present opportunities to get outside the loop of inherited Western aesthetics, and that there's this kind of like like counterintuitive link between Glissant and many others representing like a critical inheritance of the Caribbean. Fred Moten and many others talk about it, and similar tendencies to be found in Southeast Asia, because they're two like complex regions that have been, in a way, they both are like outside what we think of as like the centers of civilization, and yet have been indispensable, and are also archipelagic in nature, and have been, intense centers, if you can call it a center of trade, and colonial violence, and so many things. So the uses of language, the uses of visuality that would come out of these regions would inherently have kind of different structures to them and different qualities to them. And so to me, it's very exciting to feel like, the collective project is about like continually opening this up until we crowd out the old inheritance into a place that we want to actually live in. And just also, in some ways I was thinking, there's a play on scale in the installation upstairs. And there's this way in which there's a purposeful combination of small things and big monumental things, but also like seemingly discrete objects, like monitor-based video pieces that look like sculptures, and then like environments, like whole rooms that have no object and are more like immersive experiences. And they're sequenced in a way that you're moving between these different registers, the object, the immersive experience, then back out into a space where you see the object again, light and dark, gigantic and miniature. In some sense, I do think that in a way, like the experience that I'm hoping to simulate is like entering into a gaming environment, which is also like, you know, in a way that what I'm sure it's not just me, like, you know, the remembrance of movies like Inception, where at a certain point you keep jumping dimensions to the point that you lose track, and what you're left with is just a sense of being embedded and moving between dimensions, and it almost doesn't matter, or is hard to keep track of like which dimension is the real one.
Against originality. I think we have to close. Yeah.